Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you to everyone who is joining. Hopefully, you've had no trouble joining in. We're about to have an incredibly important conversation. I actually got a few messages from some folks saying that they weren't able to publicly say that they're attending, but they are attending. So just setting that out as a mood for how this conversation is going. My name is Iman Bukhari, and I am a member of the Canadian Cultural Mosaic Foundation, a not-for-profit working to improve race relations in what is right now known as Canada. And so with gratitude and mutual respect, I would like to acknowledge the ancestral home, culture, and the oral teachings of the Treaty 7 signatories, where I am currently situated, which includes the Siksika Nation, the Piikani Nation, the Kainai Nation, the Itika Stoney Nakoda Nation, consisting of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, Goodstoney bands, and the people of the Tsuut'ina Nation, as well as recognizing the Métis people of Alberta Region 3 who call Treaty 7 their home. Feel free to mention in the comments what territory you're joining us from, because our conversation tonight is essentially about ongoing settler colonialism in Palestine, which is why it's so important to honor the original caretakers of the land who remind us of the ongoing histories that precede us, in order to recognize our shared responsibilities going forward to help bring everyone together on this journey of truth and reconciliation. I think I speak for many people who've been part of the Free Palestine movement for many years now that this moment is very big. In terms of support, I have to say I've never seen, globally this much support and loudly against the ongoing injustices in Palestine. But at the same time, it's incredibly heartbreaking at the cost, at what the cost is for global solidarity. But here we are. And, we can have so many different conversations about this topic, ongoing settler colonialism and strategies and what should happen. But tonight we are very focused on the field of DEI, anti-oppression, anti-racist, decolonial, equity-based, social justice, and trauma-informed field of work. I'm not looking to engage in any type of hateful rhetoric that denies the genocide that's happening, or histories that are very well known. Comments like those will be ignored and deleted. And so I would appreciate everybody to please come to this space with respect. And over, the past several months, it's been made more and more evident that many in the field do not actually know how to engage in conversations about the ongoing genocide that's unfolding in Palestine. And I don't know if it's just they don't have the DEI lens or there's various different factors, but it's very evident that from the silence of folks, and DEI in general has often been seen as an agent of white supremacy, but as well as from leaders, activists, practitioners, academics, celebrities who've actually made a living standing against injustice. So it's been very sad to see that as well. And more than anything, I think it's been a rude awakening for a lot of folks, especially young folks, many whom, can't see the world the same way again. They can't enjoy the same music or the same industry or the same brands or the same public figures due to their silence or even worse, support. And I think for me personally, I was really disgusted by a statement put by the Settler Colonial Studies Journal yesterday, which had typical language of, complex history, right to defend itself, two-state solution kind of rhetoric, which I was really, really not expecting. So I think it just goes to show that capitalism is God for a lot of folks in this world. Anyways, we're gonna get into this conversation, and feel free to leave comments here as we're we're discussing this conversation. And we'll also have questions and answers towards the end. And I'm going to start introducing our panelists. We have Dr. Ed Hassan, who is a Palestinian American and Muslim author, speaker, professor. He is the founder and CEO of Kaizen Human Capital and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, where he received the Tropea Outstanding Faculty Award. He recently published a book titled Embracing Workplace, Religious Diversity and Inclusion, Key Challenges and Solutions. Thank you, Dr. Ed Hassan, for joining us. Next, we have Salam Debs. She is a Black Ethiopian anti-racism educator, an anti-oppression coach, a social justice advocate, and creator of the Anti-Racism course. Salam is also a yoga and meditation teacher, Reiki master, and holistic life coach. Her work is focused on the art of activism and healing so that we can examine and dismantle systems of oppression. We also integrate healing methods for inner and outer liberation. Thanks for joining us. And we have Mira Stern, who is a queer white Ashkenazi Jewish mama educator, actor, and DEI consultant. She is based in Yelamu, San Francisco, and her work is committed to undoing white supremacy and Zionism while rooting in future of community and sustainability. Thank you so much to each of you for joining. DEI, has its roots in the civil rights movement and has been shaped and molded over time, both by justice seekers, as well as the power establishment with anti-liberation and capitalist interests. And DEI is well known to have created essentially a new language for white comfort. This is, the unconscious biases, the implicit biases, the microaggressions, the brave spaces, the courageous conversations that we often talk about. Instead of plain old white supremacy, settler colonialism, white violence, racism, all of that. And even though that's the reality, we are at a space where DEI is under attack. Masks are fully coming off, if they were ever on to begin with. And I wanted to know each of your opinions on what you think the state of DEI is right now, as well as other social justice movements as well. Are they even real at this point, considering the silence from institutions? And where are we at right now?
There's so much to say on this topic. I'm happy to start if everybody's all good. I think firstly, it's important to name the fact that for myself, I consider myself more of an anti-racism educator than being identified more with, DEI work because of what I've seen over the years in relationship to how DEI has been co-opted. It's been whitewashed. It's been turned into this kind of corporate, capitalistic, furniture, moving propaganda often within organizational culture to, like you were saying, Iman, to really center the comfort of white folks and to not really look at redistribution of power, to not really look at settler colonialism in a real way, and instead to focus more on this idea of like representation, diversity, right, or inclusion. And one thing I always ask folks to think about, and I'm not saying that we're throwing away DEI, but I think there's some self-examination and there's some excavation that we need to do around, what do we mean even by diversity? When we're talking about diversity, often what we were saying is like whiteness is the center, right? The benchmark, the universal standard, then everything measured against that is considered diverse. And then even when we think about inclusion, what are we asking Black, Indigenous, racialized Muslim people to be included into an inherently racist, Islamophobic, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-Indigenous, culture. And so I think, number one, I think there is an importance of looking at how DEI is operating within spaces and also starting to ask ourselves really important questions, like putting a mirror up to the world that we are in terms of DEI. Yes, there is a concerted effort to, come against DEI, the anti-woke movement, and so forth. But there's also a complicity that I often see within the DEI movement of being in complicity with white supremacy. Sometimes it is for being in position to whiteness, to power, to social economic mobility. And so I think there is, on one hand, a lot of harm that's happening, from right-wing movements. But on the other hand, I think there is some excavation that we have to do within this work, because the reality is, when we think about the roots of liberation work is supposed to speak truth to power, and liberation work does require, levels of risk. And I think that there's an importance of being able to, unpack that and look at, how are we operating within the DEI world? What do we mean by diversity, equity, and inclusion? Whose comfort are we centering? And also, what proximity do we have to power and whiteness that is making it difficult sometimes for us to be able to speak truth to power in the spaces that we are in? And so long before the uprising of this kind of global understanding around the genocide towards Palestinian people, there's been an issue that DEI often doesn't have the foundational framework to speak about, the genocide towards Palestinian people, because it already has been, in many ways, unfortunately, placating corporations, institutions. And so I think there's a lot of work for us to unpack and start to develop and get back to the roots of this work, which, is in the civil rights movements.
Thank you, Salam, for starting us off. Really appreciate what you shared, and just naming how far we've strayed from the actual intentionality of radical liberation work. And while corporate spaces, or I do a lot of consulting and facilitation in schools and a lot of nonprofits here in the Bay Area, and I noticed that kind of since the US uprisings of 2020, where a lot of white folks, one day woke up and realized, like, oh, I'm white, and that means something in this world, right? The further we get from that year, it's really, we see the decline in terms of like monetary investment from companies and organizations in terms of their commitment to the work. And I think, as Salam was noting, more and more placating to maintain the status quo with a little bit of more inclusive language, right? Or a little more politicized language, but not actually any material shifts, particularly for Black and Brown people. And I, again, work with tech companies here in the Bay Area. I'm born and raised in San Francisco and saw the incredibly harmful effects of the tech boom here in the Bay. And as we've seen gentrification just exacerbate over the last decade or last 15 years, really. And in 2020, there was this opportunity. All these companies were saying, Black Lives Matter, and we're going to work on our anti-blackness, and we're going to work on our retention numbers and our hiring numbers, and just noticing literally no material change, right? And I think that for me, I'm someone who approaches this work also as a space of an educator and aiming to really heal and support folks' spiritual growth, emotional growth, and capacity for both individual and collective change in service of measurable material wins, right? And seeing that we have seen so few of those, and I think I know many colleagues in the DEI or anti-racism world are getting less and less work and less contracts and less long-term contracts with companies to actually do deeper transformative engagement. I think, of course, we're going to see, avoidance around Palestine if people are not even able to address the racial dynamics here in the United States, or for y'all, you know, in Canada?
Thank you. So I would sort of divide the state of DEI for me personally into two states, a state of abandonment and a state of guilt. I want to first say I am not calling anybody out or pointing fingers per se, but this is how I feel. A state of abandonment mainly because of after October 7th, it felt like many DEI pros and companies abandoned their Palestinian colleagues, including me. They abdicated responsibility. They only presented one narrative. And I think to a degree, they were exposed for not appreciating what it means to be a DEI professional and the weight of the responsibility of the work. I also feel a state of guilt because holding myself accountable, I wonder if I failed as a DEI advocate. Did I talk enough about the plight of the Palestinian people, my people, as a Palestinian? Or did I fall into the trap of thinking I was making progress when in reality, I fell into colonial assimilation disguised as inclusion? I don't know the answer yet. I'm still trying to figure it out. But those are sort of the two states I oscillate back and forth between.
Thank you. Sorry, I just want to say our Facebook stream and Instagram stream got cut off. I already knew this would happen, but for obvious reasons, we've been censored quite a bit. We're still going on LinkedIn. Hopefully we still go strong. I did see a comment saying that we can't see it, but it is streaming from what I can see. I just logged on to LinkedIn and it is streaming, and same on YouTube. But unfortunately, the folks who are hoping to join us on Facebook and Instagram, I hope you go to YouTube or LinkedIn to get this here. Unfortunately, that is the case for a lot of these conversations. A lot of folks are being censored. Yeah, well, thank you so much for that. I think, I think back to a research study I think I read in 2022, I think it was McKinsey and Company, that spoke about 63% of DEI leadership roles actually being occupied by white women. So I also find that interesting, where a lot of the times when people talk about DEI must die kind of thing, right? We have that attack on DEI at the moment, when it's like you're just hurting your own people, to be honest, and 63% are white women. So it's interesting to see that. And I also personally see a lot of surface level approaches to DEI, which I think is exactly why we continue to fail to make meaningful changes, despite the fact that there are billions of dollars poured into DEI initiatives, if we count it all. But building onto this question, I think what I would really like to know is, what is DEI's role in this moment in regards to what's happening in Palestine? What should practitioners be doing right now? Most seem to be sitting this one out, but I personally see our role is to ensure that, we consistently apply a social justice lens in our work and encourage us to take a deep look at, historical structures, policies, advantages, disadvantages. But at the same time, the fact is that we don't even have safe infrastructures. The fact that this event is being censored, you can't even have a conversation, right? We don't have the safe infrastructures to have these conversations, let alone solidarity. Is DEI even the space to have these conversations? It seems many of us can't even get our establishments to approve solidarity thoughts and prayers statements that are more accurate than what's being put out, if anything is put out at all. And of course, not everyone can risk their livelihoods, right, when speaking up about Palestine. So is it fair to ask every practitioner to take a principled approach to all forms of oppression? So I would love your feedback on, DEI's role in this.
Yeah, I think, when I think about DEI, I always think about the quote from Angela Davis, where she says, "I have a hard time accepting diversity as a synonym for justice. Diversity is a corporate strategy. It's a strategy designed to ensure that the institution functions in the same way that it functioned before, except that now we have more Black faces and brown faces. It's a difference that makes no difference at all. She also says, diversity without structural transformation, as you were saying, Iman, simply brings those who were previously excluded into a system as racist and misogynist as it was before. There can be no diversity and inclusion without transformational justice. And so I think, I think we have to, again, like what I was saying, go back to the roots of what this work is. Studying the work of Angela Davis, studying the, indigenous folks on these stolen lands on Turtle Island in North America, what we call North America, studying the movements of Black liberationists, anti-colonialists globally, and recognizing that, again, on one hand, there is an attack on this work, on equity work, and on the other hand, I think there is the recognition that when we aren't collectively doing this work together, that we put ourselves at risk. As Mira was saying, previous to 2020, I remember when I would speak up about Black liberation, about Black Lives Matter, and it was very taboo. I mean, in fact, people were losing their jobs. They were not being promoted. People were being called out. You were seen as a radical in a negative way. And it was incredibly, it was considered like taboo at that time. And so things changed, and the Great White Awakening happened in 2020. And we have to remember that this is the blueprint of white supremacy. This is another iteration of what we've seen happen again and again historically, whether it be the apartheid in South Africa, whether it be, liberation movements across the globe, and in relationship to Palestine, that our collective liberation is collective, literally. And I wanted to just quickly share a story about why DEI work I think is so important, because even though we know that DEI has been whitewashed and has been co-opted, most organizations and institutions are more willing to work with folks who are in the DEI world than anti-colonialist or anti-abolitionist or anti-racist. And so DEI folks are interacting mostly with organizational settings. And so recently I was actually doing a talk for an organization. And at the beginning, I was doing the lecture and starting with a land acknowledgement and making the connection between Indigenous sovereignty here in so-called Canada, and then in relationship to the Palestinian liberation movement. And immediately as I was speaking, the CEO of the organization unmuted himself, turned on his camera in front of the whole organization and said, "I am a Jewish man. I am the CEO of this organization. I'm offended by what you're saying. And I'm going to ask you that you stop talking about Palestine moving forward. We didn't hire you to do this. We've hired you to come in and talk about equity," right? And I had to say in front of the whole organization, well, you actually hired me as an anti-racism educator, which is rooted in human rights, which is rooted in social justice. And I'm not going to change the way that I'm communicating depending on what space I go into. So I am going to continue, because that is what this work is rooted in. And I had to finally say to him, like, would you like me to continue or not? And this is in front of the whole organization. And he finally said, yes, you can continue. But I say this to say that a lot of organizations and institutions are used to a kind of, soft, easy, nice type of, whitewashed version. The way that they do to Dr. King's legacy is what we're seeing in DEI work. And so we can change it. It does require risk. And I think there's an opportunity for us to examine that and start to collectively come together to do this work.
I can go next. I think if folks aren't willing to connect the dots between systems of oppression worldwide, then we will never be free, and we will never have movements that are sustained, that aren't rooted in the, kind of Western competitive identity politics, right? But actually things that are messy and gritty and not necessarily comfortable, but lead to long-term systemic shifts and shifts of the heart and psyche and spirit. And I'm a little bit of a pessimist at this point in my life, right? Looking at the state of the planet and wondering how much longer humans have here, and whether we're able to tear down these systems while humanity still like physically exists on the planet. But I know all of us who are here tonight are deeply committed to that change, not only for long-term wins for future generations, but also for people's wellness and joy and freedom and safety right now as we speak in this moment. And there's a lot of, compartmentalization, I think, of different concepts, different oppressions, different resistance movements in the West, and therefore, trickled out into the rest of the world. And there's certainly a point in us bringing Zionism and anti-Zionism and the Free Palestine movement into the DEI world. It's urgent. It is our work, whether folks want to take that upon themselves or not. And just like all of us who are anti-racism or equity or DEI professionals, whatever language or hat you want to put on, we all have areas in which we need to learn and areas in which we are not as conscientious, right? Like, I'm an able-bodied person. I'm barely in the last 5 years coming in to be a student of disability justice and understand the ways in which ableism props up white supremacy, props up patriarchy, props up homophobia, all the different systems that our work is aiming to abolish, right? And aiming to create, again, more material and psychological wellness and safety for people on this planet as we breathe. And I think there's also an urgency for the DEI world to take on a lot of this work, because where else are these conversations going to happen, right? If we're the only field that's even bringing the topics of white supremacy and racism into the workplace or into school communities or into our cultural institutions, then who else can we kind of rely on to also be naming the ills and harms of Zionism over the last 80 plus years, and to be working in solidarity with Palestinian people across the world for freedom? I think, it's the Israel-Palestine conversation was already so heavy and charged and intense before October 7th. And now with the genocide in Gaza and, the many people's very real pain and reaction to the attacks on October 7th, the conversation is even more charged and even more polarized. And we see folks really clinging to their respective politics on whatever, like, quote unquote, side they're on, and less space for there to be, connection and conversation. And I think humans actually, even though there's a lot of avoidance around this, particularly in certain spaces, folks are actually longing to have difficult conversations. I find that in my work, there's a lot of initial, there can be a lot of initial avoidance or what appears to be lack of enthusiasm for wanting to develop an anti-racist work culture, for example, right? But there's a lot of people who really want to be building that. And even, if we step into difficulty, it's an opportunity to build intimacy and relationship and connection, which I firmly believe all humans really long for and actually crave. And it's our responsibility to hold that space, right? Because the silencing has happened, it's going to continue to happen. And if we're not taking that as our charge as practitioners in this field, I truly believe that it's not going to happen elsewhere, right? And just like we've seen the silencing of every other atrocity and system that we hope to break down, like Salam was saying, right? For the last decades, certain topics around white supremacy and anti-blackness have been so taboo. And yet now, while those might be more commonplace terms or things that we're wanting to bring into our communities. You know, like there's still silencing, of course, around it, but there is change over time in terms of people's willingness to engage. And this might be really controversial to say, but I think it's also our responsibility to really, you know, to take on this work, because I think it's incredibly hard to humanize oppressors, right? And that's obviously not everyone's task in this world or in this work, but it is part of the equation. And just the way that I, as a white person, aim to really humanize fellow white folks in anti-racism work and build connection so that folks understand that they are also oppressed by the system of white supremacy, and they are also victims of this system, and not in a, you know, oppression Olympics type of comparison way, but really understanding the ways in which systems intentionally tear all of us down. As a Jew, you know, so much of my work is also about revealing to fellow Jewish folks how Zionism is also a harmful system for us, and has been really degrading of culture, of sacredness, of people's histories. And I think that that is also, you know, a larger aim of this work, and why it's urgent and necessary for us to take it on in a similar way in which the ways that kind of we engage white folks, right? And I think lastly, I just want to name that I don't think the revolution is going to happen in the workplace, right? Or in the Western workplace, that's for sure. Definitely not in the US. We are the belly of the beast. That is 1000%. But I think if DEI takes a stance in terms of trickling into workplaces, whether that's for-profit places, nonprofit places, schools, government institutions, you know, not only are we doing work in terms of making Palestinians and making anti-Zionist folks and Arab folks and Muslim folks actually safer in those spaces, but we're also eventually, you know, putting pressure on companies to take a stance and to be in alignment with BDS and other Palestinian calls on the long path ahead for freedom.
So I want to follow Salam's lead here in quoting Angela Davis. Angela Davis stated that Palestine is the moral litmus test for the world. And I had posted this before, and I also stated, I likewise view the fair treatment of all employees, including Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim employees, as a moral litmus test for the company's commitment to DE9. And I think we failed that so far, candidly. So what does DE9 have at this moment as far as its role? With great humility, I don't know the how, but I do know the what. And it's to move social justice to the fore and focus on societal change. I once believed, wrongly so, that we could engender societal change through our organizations, meaning if we could get leaders to be inclusive and welcoming of all employees and focus on DE9 internally, then somehow magically we could influence society outside the organization. You all know I was wrong. We need to start with society. We need to start with our politicians, our legal system. We need to start with our communities, our schools. At the end of the day, societal rules influence organizations. We can't pretend that there is a hidden barrier. If our employees don't feel welcome in society, then how can we expect them to feel welcomed at work? It's impossible. So I am telling you, as somebody who has worked with many executives across many organizations, I believe that I could somehow work with these individuals and get them to understand the importance of social justice through the lens of their organization. I am telling you, as a Palestinian American, I learned the hard way I was wrong. They turned their back on us or on me many times after October 7th. So what I've learned here is we need to start a society. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know how that's going to work. I know that puts people's jobs at risk and their livelihoods at risk. I know what I'm doing. And many of you who know me and who may follow me know that traditionally I wasn't so vocal on social media. Well, the hell with that. I'm going to be very social on social media, and I'm going to keep it real going forward.
Thank you. I'm recalling Black author and journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates in his interview that he did, I think in October sometime, about apartheid in Palestine. And he said, I have to measure my fear against the misery that I saw. And I think that's so important. And at the end of the day, how you practice and honor what's important to you and your values is really up to you. But I think that is the heart of social justice movements and practitioners, regardless of what may happen. But I know it's easier said than done. I keep getting emails saying that people are trying to log into our account and hack in. That's great. So that's just the reality of this conversation, not being able to even post this on certain platforms, which has never happened before. We've done so many live events even prior to 2020. Just want to say censorship is very, very real. And now I have 3 specific questions for each of you, and feel free to discuss with as others may want to as well. But to Dr. Ed, I really wanted to talk about the concept of anti-Palestinianism and why that's unique and has been growing since 1948. I know that, anti-Palestinian rhetoric has been around a lot. Anti-Arab rhetoric has been around. Islamophobic rhetoric has been around. But I think, the concept of anti-Palestinianism being unique is really important for folks to understand. So if you can tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. So I think I would frame it this way. I believe anti-Palestinianism and Islamophobia are rooted in Orientalism. And Orientalism, defined by Palestinian author Edward Said, if you may or may not know, is a Western depiction and stereotyping of cultures and peoples of Asia and North Africa, framed through the colonial lens. It is a framework to justify colonial agendas. And the agenda is to steal land and subjugate indigenous people. And how do they do that? By denying existence. Invoke what the Europeans call terra nullius, or nobody's land. And the Zionist version of nobody's land is to say a land without a people for a people without a land. And when you deny existence, language is important. And you will not use the word Palestine or Palestinian. As you can tell, people are even afraid to say Palestinian hummus. So let me be clear. Anti-Palestinianism is another form of hate that is influenced by Islamophobia, but it is not Islamophobia. It is a colonial attempt to erase a people, so much so that they would prefer to bunch it in with Islamophobia. Imagine that. Right now, the world would rather deal with Islamophobia than deal with anti-Palestinianism. Think about that for a second.
Thank you, Dr. Ed. Salam, I wanted to specifically ask about anti-blackness in this moment right now. And many in our field know that anti-blackness is the blueprint for white supremacy. Along with capitalism, system born out of chattel slavery, power being distributed according to a hierarchy of race or skin, and wealth being generated through exploitation in general to keep people where they are, or keep them, underclassed by state violence as well. But can you help us understand how anti-Black racism has played a role in what's happening in Gaza over the past few months, and even Black solidarity with Palestine? Because I see that being villainized quite a bit.
Yeah, thank you, Iman, for the question. It's such a big conversation, but I'm going to try to narrow it as much as possible, which is, we can talk about how anti-Black racism shows up in many different ways in relationship to, first of all, like you said, the blueprint of white supremacy being anti-Black racism. In other words, when we think about the iterations of how oppression at the intersection of white supremacy shows up historically and globally, that there is this racial hierarchy, like you said, Iman, which is this idea that Black indigenous people being at the bottom of this racial hierarchy. But also when we look at many different racial identities, dark-skinned people, black-skinned people, dark-skinned, darker skinned people being the most disenfranchised, experiencing the most disparities, whichever part of the world you go to. So we know this as a fact. And so there is that understanding around this kind of iteration of white supremacy in relationship to anti-Black racism. And it's important for us to understand how it is connected to the Palestinian movement. I mean, obviously, we know how Dr. King and Angela Davis and Malcolm X and all of the incredible leaders, James Baldwin, made this correlation between how the violence and the destabilization and the degradation of Black people globally is deeply connected to the fight for liberation of Palestinian people. So that's one aspect. The other aspect of that, though, that is hard for us to talk about, but remember, DEI work, anti-racism work, equity work, liberation work is about telling the truth. And that there is also an anti-Black rhetoric that happens within the Arab world, right? And part of that is the erasure of like Black Muslim experiences. So for example, we know that over 55% of the Muslim population is Black. And yet there is a historical aspect of that kind of erasure or that violence that happens within our community. And so as we're doing this work, like as we're doing this important, critical, life-saving work of Free Palestine, we also need to make sure, as we quote Audre Lorde, who says, we cannot dismantle, the master's house with the master's tools. We have to make sure that we're not replicating the same model, the same blueprint, the same tools, the same kind of violence by erasing, what has happened historically, so that we're not then now being performative and perpetuating the same type of violence. And so as we are dismantling, we're part of this anti-colonial movement globally, we also have to address how anti-Black racism is showing up in the work that we are doing, so that we can do it in a way in which we say, yes, white supremacy is the common denominator to all of our oppression. And unfortunately, it has left the residue of anti-Black racism within the movements that we are fighting for. And so, I think it's important for us to also name the fact that, part of how colonialism works, white supremacy colonialism, is that kind of divide and conquer. And so there is a healing that needs to happen, like Mira was saying. Like, how do we integrate healing into our work? As DEI, anti-racism, equity practitioners, we have to think about, like, are we replicating the master's tools? The oppressor's tools, not to use the word master, I don't use that term, but the oppressor's tools. And what does it look like to integrate transparency, honesty, not reductionist history, telling the truth as we go along this journey of fighting for our collective liberation, and understanding that a big part of why there is an erasure and silencing of Sudan, of the genocide in Sudan, in Congo, in Ethiopia, and so forth, is anti-Black racism, right? And so while we're doing this work, it's important for us to do that. And the last thing I'll just quickly say is that, the reality is that we don't get free until Black people are free. And that includes Black Muslim people. And that's a really big part of how we begin to do this anti-colonial work in relationship to freeing Palestinians. We have to think about why, how anti-Black racism is functioning in the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Salam. I've also been thinking about, South Africa making that case against Israel, and just seeing the rhetoric on Twitter, X in particular, as well as other places, has been very, it really shows how people are thinking right now about Black people in particular. And even just, South Africa being told to focus on domestic issues, right? And not focus on Israel and their racism, because never has poverty, corruption, human rights abuses ever happened in America or in Canada or in other places. We love to police the world, but never think about ourselves. So that's really been interesting to see. And of course, totally rooted in anti-Black racism. as well. Mira, I wanted to, I think, really talk to you and really put you on the spot here, because I think the most difficult part in this conversation that a lot of folks have is the fact that anti-Semitism is obviously very real, and Jewish folks in particular in history are a persecuted people, and Israel is run by Jewish folks, and the land was given to them. So I think people have a hard time even understanding, unfortunately, what is anti-Semitism. So I would love for you to explain what is anti-Semitism, what is not anti-Semitism, particularly in this case that we've been seeing around. We've been seeing that, weaponized quite a bit. I'm hearing, at least on the news, that some rallies, pro-Palestine rallies, are also considered anti-Semitic. And obviously, we always want to be respectful towards every community. I would also love to hear your perspective as an anti-Zionist Jewish person about Zionism, because does Zionism require Palestinians to not exist in Palestine in order for it to exist? Is there such a thing as liberal Zionism? I would love that feedback, and it seems like somebody in our comments would also like that feedback as well, of how are you opening your mind, everybody really opening your mind to all perspectives, and what about the Zionist perspective? So would love your feedback, and everybody else too, feel free to chime in.
There's so many great questions. I don't think I have enough time or brain space to even make sure I hit all of those, but please, I'm going to do my best and then you can follow up. So anti-Semitism is one of the oldest oppressions in the world. It is a system that, Judaism is 5,800 years old formally, and similar to patriarchy, right? It's one of the oldest, anti-Semitism is one of the oldest long-lasting forms of oppression. Since there were Jewish people, there have been folks trying to critique, reject, ostracize Jewish folks, right? And Judaism, of course, stems from the land of Palestine and is one of the Abrahamic religions. And Abraham, again, was from Iraq, actually, not Palestine, right? So if we want to be like, where are we actually indigenous to? Are we indigenous to Iraq? I don't know. But just remembering, I think it's so important in this conversation. Folks like to rewind the clock to often whenever is kind of convenient to, particularly for like the Zionist narrative, right? And teasing out anti-Semitism from anti-Zionism is essential, right, to our movement, and essential to folks' safety, essential to folks who we want to bring into the movement. And it can sometimes be really difficult and really fraught because there are overlaps at times. And I think it's important to name that. So, Jewish trauma is really triggered in moments of any time that there's Jewish death, whether it's intentionally anti-Semitic or not, whether, when any like kind of Jews as a collective are critiqued, that really triggers this ancient, long-lasting trauma that many Jewish people carry in their bodies and in their DNA and in their spirits. And that is also culturally really taught and really focused on. I know, at least, I can speak for myself and the Jewish community that I grew up in the Bay Area. So while Jewish trauma is not certainly the center at all of this movement, of this moment or the movement, within the Jewish community, it's really essential for us to engage with this grief and this trauma and fear in order to metabolize it and move forward and understand when something is actually anti-Semitic and a threat to our wellness and safety, and when something is, something that is not actually attacking Jewish people and is about talking about power and oppression and privilege. So I think also, that's one of the creation of Israel created a trillion tragedies. And one of the greatest ironic tragedies is that this was a country initially very, very, very early on, the intentions were to be a safe space for Jewish people away from the anti-Semitism of Eastern Europe. And the creation of Israel has actually just generated more and more and more anti-Semitism, right? And that's, I think, one of the ridiculous ironies that many Jewish folks are not even willing to grapple with. But I believe that Zionism is anti-Semitic. I used to be a Zionist. I grew up in a liberal Jewish community, predominantly white in the Bay Area, and went on Zionist trips as a teenager to what I was taught, the land of Israel, right? And only within, of course, the 48 territories. So you see a really specific history, and you see a really specific narrative being presented to you. And we were taught, as Dr. Hassan said, a land without a people for a people without a land, right? We were taught these narratives that really shape a young person's understanding, right? And if you hear it over and over again when you're 7 and 9 and 13, that's of course how you're going to view the world. Just the way that white kids, are shaped in the culture of white supremacy, and all of us, right? All kids in this society are shaped within that culture, and we internalize in different ways. And back to, the differentiation, I think, between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is that Israel creates more and more anti-Semitism because the project of Zionism conflates all Jews as believing in the state of Israel and the state of Israel existing at all costs, as you were naming, Iman, right? Of existing at the expense of Palestinian livelihood and wellness and connection to their ancestral land. And so it's not that, the oppressors in Israel happen to be Jewish and are, and folks are like, look at what these Jewish folks are doing, right? It's that they are doing everything they are doing in the name of Judaism, in the name of our faith, in the name of our people, and conflating Jews around the world. I see you, Jeff. We'll get to you in a minute. I see your comments, okay? Conflating people around the world with this project. And it is the status quo in most Jewish communities. And of course, anti-Zionism has existed since Zionism was created. I want to be really clear about that. There were radical bundists, they were called, in the shtetls of Eastern Europe who knew from the onset that this was going to be a devastating project, not only to create a life on top of other people's homes and memories and communities, but also this idea that we can exist in diaspora in joy and power and culture, right? I personally don't identify as being indigenous to anywhere as an Ashkenazi Jew. I don't identify as being indigenous to Palestine. I also don't identify as being indigenous to Europe. And I think there's a lot of power in folks claiming this diasporist identity and culture. Because yes, while Jews have had moments of unsafety in all the places we've inhabited, whether that's the Arab world, whether that's in, Western Asia, whether that's in Europe, Jews have also deeply immersed themselves in the communities that they lived in for thousands of years and created multiple different identities within the Jewish spectrum, right? And within the Jewish sphere. So I think a long-term movement holds the needs of Jewish safety and combating anti-Semitism alongside all the other systems we're attempting to abolish. And while certain critiques, I think, can be anti-Semitic, like blaming all Jews for the actions of Israel, or sometimes on social media, I see posts that I feel like people just kind of substitute the word Jewish for Zionist, and that always triggers me a little bit. Like, Zionists control the media, right? Like, we hear that about Jews, like Jews control the media, or Jews run the banks, or these anti-Semitic tropes that again have existed for thousands of years. But again, I think part of the larger puzzle is really focusing on what it means for our Jewish community to work on our own healing that we're responsible for, and to also combat anti-Semitism globally, right? Within the white and European world, within the Arab world, within anywhere that Jews exist or have existed. Critiquing a nation state is not anti-Semitic, right? And in fact, aligns you with your larger politics of wanting there to be safety and wellness and equity for all people. I think it's also really essential for us to name that most Zionists are actually white Christians, and that most funding and lobbying power comes from the Christian Zionist world, and that is seldom named, but of course, because it's predominantly Jews in Israel who are the ones enacting genocide and atrocity after atrocity after atrocity. But, you know, I think it's part of the larger question of really who benefits when Islamophobia and anti-Semitism rise. Like, who actually benefits when those two, when the flames of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are stoked? It's not really the other group, right? It's the same folks who have maintained colonial power for centuries on this planet. And I'd love to see more Christian folks who grew up in the evangelical Christian world speak out. Like, for example, there are 7.5 million Jewish people in what we currently call the United States. And CUFI, which is the largest Christian Zionist organization, Christians United for Israel, has 10 million members. And that's just the biggest org, right? That's not even all of them. So there are literally more Christian Zionists who are aligned with the state of Israel and believe that Jesus will come again and the rapture will happen when the land is inhabited by predominantly Jews. There are more Christian Zionists than even Jews in the US, right? So again, part of the huge conversation around who is really behind the political propping up of Israel by the United States and by other Western nations, and part of our larger movement work. I hope I answered all of your questions, but happy to circle back during our Q&A time.
Thank you. I just one more question to just clarify that aspect. So you said criticizing actions of government is not anti-Semitic, which I assumed as well. But how about folks talking about the colonial settler project of Israel being dismantled and creating a new, like a one-state solution for all? Is that also anti-Semitic? Because at least what I have heard from folks is they have told me that's anti-Semitic because you're getting rid of safety for Jewish folks. And this is the only place that we've ever been safe, which I know you've spoken about as well. But is it okay to want the colonial settler project of Israel to end and actually have something new where everyone has equal rights and there is no Jewish supremacy?
That's the dream, right? And Bezrat Hashem, inshallah, we will see that in our lifetimes, and that's what we are working for. I think that, again, you know, in the phrase, like, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, that sentiment and that phrase are really can be triggering to Jewish people in the sense of, like, where are we supposed to go? They want us dead. They, you know, and that's, again, our responsibility. That's our interpretation. That's not most people's intentionality when they say that, or when they envision the end of a settler project, the end of this supremacist colonial entity. I love the work of Karina Gould, who is a Chochenyo Ohlone leader here in the East Bay of the Bay Area. Her, you know, family has been here for 10,000 years. She can trace, you know, her people back. And she talks about coming correct as a settler. And I really like to follow that wisdom, because it's not like, are there indigenous people who are like, all settlers get off of Turtle Island, get off of what we currently call Canada and the US? Sure, right? I'm sure there's some people who are like, that's the only way we will achieve actual liberation. That's a really small percentage too, right? I think for the most part, if you listen to time and time again, Indigenous leaders being like, we would love reparations, right? We would love access to our land, access to our culture, the erasure of colonial institutions. And for me, as a settler here, there are ways to come with respect, to come with humility, and to come following the leadership of folks who have been on this land for generations and generations and generations. Just as I think it's possible, and it will be painful and ugly and contentious to the process of creating a one state, but I do think it's the only way forward that's actually going to lead to safety and belonging and interconnectedness for all people. And that is going to require folks who cannot trace back generations and generations by name, by actual, like, this is where my family has lived for the last 500 years, right? To come correct and to come from a space of healing and repair. And again, I think, there is this very long millennia of Jewish trauma that narrate a lot of the response to both the brutality of October 7th and also the ongoing calls for a free Palestine. And it's part of the conversation. And I think it's mainly an internal, Jewish responsibility of what it means for us to heal that, so that every time we hear Israel does not have a right to exist, it's not about we hate Jewish people and we don't want Jews to exist and we don't want to live embedded in community with Jews. It's more about the project of Israel, just like the project of Canada, the project of the United States, the project of South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, all settler colonies need to be dismantled so that there actually can be true return to Indigenous frameworks of respect for all humans and respect for the earth.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ed or Salam. Did you want to add anything to that before we get to questions?
Nope. I co-sign everything that was stated.
I wouldn't mind just adding a little something to that. I really appreciate everything that you were sharing, Mira. And I think that when we think about DEI work, right, because this is what we're talking about in relationship to Palestinian liberation, that we have to, because the term, for example, safety is used a lot in DEI, right? We talk about safe spaces, safe communities, safe environments, but I do think it's important for us to examine what we mean by safety, right? And even when we think about Zionism, which we know is, rooted in the same iteration, like, of how settler colonial white supremacy, ideology operates, that we see that even in white community, in white folks saying like, oh, I don't like the fact that you're doing this like anti-racism work or this DI work because it's making me uncomfortable, because it makes me feel unsafe, because it makes me feel like I have to, put a mirror up to how I'm complicit, how I benefit from systems of oppression. And I see that again and again in spaces that I'm in where I'm talking about the liberation of Black and brown and racialized and Indigenous peoples. And I hear again and again white folks saying to me, Salam, like, you're making me feel shame. You're making me feel guilt. You're making me feel fear. And part of that fear, I think we have to unpack, is part of it is also loss of power, loss of domination, right? And part of it is like starting to unpack that as well, so that we are centering the most vulnerable and we are centering the voices and the people who are, like someone was sharing in the comments, being slaughtered, experiencing ethnic cleansing, experiencing genocide. I know that, for example, in South Africa, when the apartheid ended, a lot of white settlers were like worried and fearful of this kind of Black peril. Oh, what's going to happen to us? Now we're losing our power. Now we're losing our domination. What's going to happen to us in that sense? So I think we need to unpack our ideas around what safety looks like and really get clear that if your safety relies on the degradation and the slaughtering and the genocide and the oppression of a group of people, it's not actually safety. It's just a loss of power, right? It's a loss of power. It's a loss of domination. And so I think it's important for us to always remember that when we're talking about, whether we're talking about Zionism or white supremacy or patriarchy or ableism, that they all kind of play the same iteration, the same blueprints. So if we want to understand one, power dynamic, we can just look at another one and we can start to connect the dots. And the other thing I wanted to just quickly share is that right before a couple of years ago, I remember I wanted to talk about Palestine, but I felt really scared to do so. And I remember not feeling I had the insight. I didn't think I had the wisdom. I didn't think I had the education. And I remember an Afro-Palestinian, woman, a friend of mine, saying to me, like, Salam, I really want you, I really need you to share. Like, you're an anti-racism educator. I need you to speak up. And I took the time, to educate myself, to do the work, to speak up. And I will never forget, the level of violence that I experienced, outside of just white supremacy in general, and like the truckers movement that happened in so-called Canada and how it impacted me as a Black woman. The Zionist movement was one of the most terrifying experiences I also had. And I spoke to many other Black and Indigenous and racialized people who were having the same experience. And so, again, I think it's really important as we're thinking about healing and as we're thinking about decolonization. Someone said in the comment, like, decolonization is not a metaphor. It's real. And actually, I don't know, maybe we do have to leave, Turtle Island. I don't know. And if that was to be the case, I think we have to think about, who again are we centering and what it means for land back. Because those are the principles of indigenous sovereignty principles. One of them is land back, being in right relations, but a big part of it is land back. So I think if we're connecting the dots, it is important for us to think about power redistribution, land back, healing, but healing in a way that always centers those who are most vulnerable.
Thank you so much, Salam. So if anybody has specific questions, respectful, specific questions that have not already been addressed, because I will say Mira in particular has addressed a lot already in regards to Jeff's comments, and I see you're kind of commenting back on here as well. But if there are specific questions, please do start mentioning them here. And panelists, if there are some that have already kind of been asked, feel free to kind of get through. There's just been so many comments for an event that's being censored. This is great that we're able to still have this conversation to address. I'm trying to see here something that came up. Once the settler ecosystems are dismantled, how can Indigenous communities heal when their original frameworks have been replaced? And anybody is kind of welcome to answer that as well.
I'm going to pass the mic on that one. Not for me to answer as someone who is a settler. And again, my work focuses on the ways in which we can organize for reparations and healing our own wounds of hoarding power and divesting from our own indigeneity, right? And working to reclaim that in different ways.
Salam, I'll hand it to you. I don't think, healing, I don't know what that looks like. I think we're so in phase one, not even at the start of phase one, right? In figuring out how to dismantle it. I don't even know what healing looks like. I don't know if I'm going to see it in my lifetime. Just keep in mind, my very existence as a Palestinian American is viewed as anti-Semitic. How scary is that? My kids, who are Palestinian Americans, are viewed automatically just because of our existence. Anything on my LinkedIn profile or on my X page or Instagram that suggests that I am Palestinian, it is viewed as anti-Semitic, and I get death threats. I get very mean messages. I'm a sensitive person. Not really. You keep bringing it on. It's all good. But it's really scary to me, the fact that people are really conflating this to an extent where a very existence of a human being is viewed as anti-Semitic. That's very scary.
Do you want to add on that, Salam?
I think the only thing I would say is that, yeah, we're in a critical moment. We're literally critically fighting for the existence of a group of people to be here, and even speaking about Palestinians or the Free Palestinian movement puts you at risk. And so I think sometimes there is a perspective of wanting to like progress to this like solution-based future, but we are, I think, in a state of critical mass awakening and demanding freedom for Palestinians and the ending of the settler colonial occupation. And I do think that healing is justice, to begin with, and we need justice, and we're nowhere even close to that. So,
and just to add to that really quick, I think that there has to sort of be some sort of transitional justice, and that comes in different shapes and forms, similar to what we saw in South Africa. I don't know how it would look in this situation in particular, but I think that could be looked at as a model, possibly.
Absolutely. And also the Truth and Reconciliation here in so-called Canada. There's been a lot of work around that, but Indigenous people have had to demand that, And if you think about there's still a destabilization in South Africa. So thank you, Dr. Hassan, for naming that. I think we can look at other models and how anti-colonial movements have progressed. But I think we are in a critical stage right now in terms of freeing Palestinian people.
Thank you, Salam, for bringing up TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I mean, there's been, I think I just read it on the news, 12 or 14, something like that, calls done. So it's going to, like if we do one every year or whatever the rate has been, it's going to take, 80 to 90 years to actually get it done, if we get it done at all. So that's, learn from so-called Canada that we're not succeeding. This is not the way to do it. A lot of people are hurting, and every single person deserves to live a life of safety. And I've seen some comments here talking about pro-Hamas protests. And I think people really, really need to understand that 30,000 people are dead within 3.5 months. Like, this is not a joke.
And counting.
Counting, yes, that's ongoing. I saw one of the most saddest, TikTok lives yesterday of Bisan talking about what's happening in the hospital that she was staying around, and the occupation taking over. Regardless of your personal identity, I wish every single person could really just open their eyes and see that this is really happening. Our media, Western media, may not be showing it, but this is happening. People on TikTok, people on Instagram are not faking anything. How much can you fake? This population isn't exactly the most richest in the world. They don't have access to AI to create all these horrific images. The dead babies that we've seen are not a joke. Like this, and an entire generation of people are being traumatized. I don't even know how they will, as Dr. Ed has said, how do you even heal, especially to the people living there, and then everybody else, the Palestinians in the diaspora, and everyone else too, that like the youth that are so active, that are so pro-Palestine, that want these people to be free. How are they going to overcome it? I think we really need to see things beyond our perspective. And whataboutism isn't going to get us there. What about Sudan? What about Congo? What about Afghanistan? What about everything else? Our struggles are all linked. We can't just throw that aside. Our world is messed up. Yes, Megan, our world is really messed up. So let's make it a better place. Sorry, I'm trying to see questions here. I'm just gonna, there's so many questions to go over. If panelists see any, please let me know. I think I see one here. If our pro-Palestinian DEI work at our workplace has led to blow-ups and retribution by someone who is Jewish and acting out of pain, and a group who doesn't know how to react to the verbal violence, how do we come back from that? How do we call them in with compassion and heal the psychological safety of the space while advocating for our own humanity and needs?
I'll start. How do we come back from that? I think the larger question is, how do we get here? We can't call people in if we don't own what happened. We can't call people in if we don't acknowledge what's going on. The old days of DEI is, I'm going to call you in and we're going to create a room of psychological safety. That's not working. At some point, you have to understand that's not going to work. It hasn't worked. Believe me, I tried it. And many of my clients will tell you that I've tried it. So I don't think, simply calling them back in. I think we have to own it, as I mentioned, and really acknowledge the pain and suffering that people are going through. And by the way, at this point, what we're learning is corporations, colonialists, are not going to open the door for us. They're not going to give us a seat at the table. So we're going to have to take it, or we're going to have to build our own table. That's just the reality. And that we may not see the fruits of that labor for many generations, but I don't see any other way, candidly speaking.
Yeah, I agree completely with Dr. Hassan that we need to tell the truth, and I know it's cliche to say the truth hurts, but actually the truth is liberating. The truth hurts actually those who need the status quo to remain the same, right? For those who need that kind of erasure or reductionist history. And many depend on that when we think about many different identities. But, today we're talking about DEI, anti-racism, the Palestinian movement, and so forth. And so we have to, part of doing this work is telling the truth. Like, it's literally unethical for us to move in the world and to do this work and not tell the truth. And part of what I was saying at the beginning of this is that because DEI has been co-opted and whitewashed, we're not used to telling the truth. So it feels like a big jump to go from, this kind of pacifying work within a lot of organizational settings to now jumping to this really radical liberation work, which isn't actually radical, but it feels radical to those who have been kind of living in this placating or comforting white folks or comforting those from dominant identities. And so I think we need to recognize that the truth is liberating. And part of the workplace cultures that we are operating within, or organization or institutional cultures, are rooted in a very white colonial, so-called safe culture that cannot deal with confrontation, uncomfortable conversations, difficult conversations. And so we wonder why we can't even discuss Palestine, or we can't discuss white supremacy or anti-Black racism or anti-abolition work. Well, how can we, when we are operating within environments that are maintaining the status quo, that are maintaining this idea of like white women fragility or white, masculine fragility and so forth. And so we need to do the work of thinking about what are our ethics and also what are our guiding principles. What is this work really rooted in, so that we can, skip the whole, I feel defensive, I feel triggered, I feel all of these things, and get to the importance of this work, which is liberating all of us. Like as Mira said earlier, white supremacy, colonialism, Zionism, patriarchy, misogyny, ableism, colonialism is killing all of us. we are all being impacted, by this violence. And so, yes, there may be a sort of temporary discomfort, but again, who are we centering? And we need to center the voices of those who have been silenced, who have, who have been disenfranchised, who have been denied equity. And in this case, in this conversation, who are literally experiencing ethnic cleansing and genocide as we speak. And so I think that that's really important.
I also just wanted to bring up Amina's comments here because I have dealt with that myself. She says, I think what gets really problematic in those situations is that if a Jewish person who got upset is also white in a white-dominated space where the facilitator is brown Muslim like me, there is a huge imbalance of power. I have seen this multiple times, myself included, sitting on government anti-racism committees, trying to have this conversation and it going the exact opposite side. And I think there was a comment here somewhere talking about truth, or this is my truth and that's your truth. And that's fair. Everybody is the center of their universe, and indeed. But when people are physically dying, that is a reality and that is a truth. And there is no reason for us as human beings to normalize that. We've normalized as a society and as human beings that people all over Africa are continuously dying, right? We've normalized that in several parts of West Asia, also known as Middle East. We've normalized that in South Asia. We've normalized that in all across the world, particularly where people of color live. And that should never be the case. We don't have to play, oppression Olympics per se. We can actually have all of our backs. And I love the conversations that we've been having about, colonial powers and how the problem is colonialism. And if we get away from that, we can all free ourselves.
I'm not going to directly answer it. I'm tired of calling this a conflict. It's a genocide. Seriously, we have to stop that. It's not a conflict. It's a genocide. People are being murdered unconditionally. It's a genocide. You're asking how to solve the problem of the conflict. It's not a conflict. It's a genocide. How about we stop the killing and then we talk? How about we have a ceasefire and then we talk?
I just want to add to that. My brother-in-law is Palestinian. He's had 36 members of his family killed since October the 7th. And, I see Jeff's comment here saying, what do the panelists recommend to solve the ongoing conflict? And we can certainly get to that. I just wanted to mention my brother-in-law's opinion on that. And he said that, a lot of people like to talk about, well, what's the solution? 1 state, 2 state, get out of here, go to Egypt, wherever, and it's like, he's been like, give us a chance. Give us a chance to thrive. Give us a chance to live. Give us the ability to succeed, and we can work together to figure out a solution. We haven't even been given the chance. We've been seen as savages. We've been seen as barbaric terrorists. We haven't been given equal rights. So instead of jumping to what is the solution, what do we need to do, which, by the way, this isn't like a political conversation to begin with. We're talking about DEI in particular, and we can talk about other things, but just saying, giving the chance to people is something very important. I just wanted to add that as my brother-in-law had said that. Yeah, if you wanted to talk about recommendations, you certainly can. We're coming close to time, so if there are any other questions, I would recommend now. I know earlier on it was way above, so I don't want to scroll all the way. Somebody had asked about, well, is it a genocide? Is it not a genocide? And I think Dr. Ed really specifies exactly what it is. So I hope that's clear, regardless of what white supremacist institutions might tell us. Based off of court hearings and other things, I think it's clear. All right. So, any last comments from our panelists? All right. Well, thank you so much. I really just want to say that this is a very traumatic conversation, and I recognize that, and I'm very sorry to have put this trauma on you, to be honest. But I appreciate the immense amount of labor it takes to have this conversation, and I hope every single person tuning in recognizes that as well. We have posted socials for all the folks that have joined us today. Please support them. I think that's really important, to support them and the work that they do. I also would like to end with this closing statement, which is actually a quote by James Baldwin, which says, "The world is held together, really it is, held together by the love and passion of a very few people." And I really, really feel that right now. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you have a good night. Bye.
Thank you, Iman.
Thank you so much, Iman.
Thank you, Iman, for creating this space for all of us to have this conversation.
Thank you.